So imagine the following scenario. You're a med student or medical doctor in real life, in a hospital at 2 a.m. and you're on call. It's really quiet, you don't know who's around, and suddenly there's a code which is called, code blue. You rush into the room and there's half a dozen people, you only know a couple of their names, and you have to figure out, what do you do next? Do you remember what the appropriate drug to inject is? And do you remember the right joules to set on the defibrillator? Another kind of high-impact domain which has these life or death situations is aviation. So in aviation, you also have teams of people working in these tasks which take perhaps a long time, and just as in aviation, you sometimes have hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. And so aviation and medicine have this kind of similar component of having really complex, perilous procedures where really trained professionals have to cope in really fast time demands. And in aviation, one of the tools they use to manage this complexity is checklists. So for several decades now, it's been very standard to use checklists during routine operations and during crises. So when you're taking off, you pull out the checklist. When you're about to crash into the river, you also take out the checklist. It doesn't really matter. So in contrast, in medicine, the use of checklists hasn't been as widely distributed or used. It's something where only now are checklists starting to be used much more commonly during both routine care and in crisis care. So Atul Gawande is one of the people that has kind of popularized and kind of written really cogently about the importance of checklists in medicine. And here's some example of one of the checklists that has been well studied in terms of helping people to do better surgeries. So it has very simple things such as, before you start the surgery, do you do a timeout? Is it the right patients? Is it the right procedure? Is it the right side? And then you go through all these pre-surgical safety timeouts. But similar checklists have actually been shown to make big differences in outcomes. So in 10-day trials looking at central lines, it drastically changes infection rates. And in other multi-site trials, it can really change lives and save lots of money. But in contrast, medicine is still kind of evolving as a field. Unlike in aviation, there's no kind of central body which records all medical errors and records everything which happens. So this is an example of what you might see in a hospital OR, where doctors may just kind of go and write down some of these information by hands that may help them during their tasks. Here's a more formalized version which they use at Stanford. So if you're at an institution like Stanford or Harvard Medical School, you'll be trained in the use of these checklists, and they call them more broadly cognitive aids during your training. So this particular cognitive aid addresses the condition of pulseless electrical activity and kind of walks you through things you should check and make sure you don't miss, as well as things that you should think about during the treatment protocol. So how do these cognitive aids help when they do help? So if you think about it, they're an aid to not only memory, but attention. So oftentimes, if you're called into code, perhaps you haven't done this procedure in a month or a year. There's also procedures which most doctors don't see in their lifetimes. And are you going to remember the right procedures that you want to do from your medical training? So besides memory, it's also an attention aid. Are you attending to the right things in this right moment? So we know that during stress, your attention narrows and your cognitive processes get more limited. And so these external cognitive aids essentially put knowledge into the world rather than keeping them in your brain. They also help with training. So they kind of define these mental schema so that both novices and experts can kind of go back and refer to them and keep up to date with what changes in medicine. And one might argue that cognitive aids may help teams maintain a shared mental model. If you pull out the aid, do you know what procedure we're doing? Are you on the kind of same page? And it's been shown in aviation that shared mental models can increase team performance. And finally, when you talk about individual performance, one doctor said that you really want these aids to raise up the level of these lowest performers. So maybe people who are less experienced or are working on something which is not their specialty. You want to kind of raise these people up to the average. So as part of our design process, we spent some time observing this anesthesia crisis resource management class. So this is adapted from aviation, where they have these crisis management classes or cockpit resource management classes, where they teach people the kind of soft skills or non-technical skills that they use to work together. For example, how do you delegate and work as a team? How do you anticipate and distribute workload? How do you allocate your attention and use all the resources that you have available? So in this project, we focus specifically on the attentional aspects and on these resources aspects. So these kind of cognitive aids are just one of the resources that doctors can call upon as they're solving problems. So during your medical training, maybe you're sitting in LKSC across the street, kind of paying attention in lecture as you guys have done. But an important part of their training is not just in lecture, but in more realistic situations. So just as in aviation, people will train on simulation for many hours before they graduate, medical doctors are starting to train more in medical simulations. So these are high-fidelity medical simulators where doctors actually go in and practice skills such as, how do you pay attention and keep track of all these tasks which are going on in a busy scenario. So pictured here is actually a simulator in the basement of the Lake Hashing building across the streets. And you have people participating in these kind of simulated emergencies. You have these really fantastic and comprehensive medical simulators where everything is real except the patients. You have the gases, you have drugs, you have vials, you have all these things which you can operate on. But the patient is obviously a mannequin. And the mannequin can talk, it can shake, it can emit various bodily fluids at certain points in time. So basically, you kind of forget that you're working with this kind of fake patient. But behind the scenes, there's these kind of dungeon masters or people controlling the situation from behind the scenario. And so here you have David Gaba, who's actually an anesthesiologist here, who pioneered high-fidelity simulation in anesthesia 25 years ago. And so here he's kind of watching what's going on. These are probably residents who are going through some training. And there's a pre-scripted scenario, what monsters will you run into and what will happen. So they'll be controlling the patient, kind of changing their life vital signs and kind of directing. Sometimes the voice of God will say certain things like, they'll ask like, oh, is this going in a certain way? And then if the simulator doesn't support that, the voice of God will say, yes, you feel something that is lumpy or something. So it provides for human-computer interaction researchers this great opportunity to not only observe in situations where you don't have to deal with HIPAA concerns with privacy, and also you can kind of intervene. So in HCI, you talk about Wizard of Oz, where someone can kind of control behind the scenes, and this provides a really great opportunity for kind of amazing Wizard of Oz scenarios. So Jesse and I spent a year and a half kind of observing lots of these different anesthesia courses. So we watched dozens of doctors kind of go through many of these scenarios, watching from safely behind the one-way mirror. So for example, we watched the same patient die in the same way half a dozen times from the same exact thing. But we saw half a dozen doctors treat that patient very differently in terms of how they diagnosed that patient, how they delegated amongst the team. Did they ask people for heads help in addition to hands help? Did they communicate effectively with other people in the room? For example, did they say, Stu, can you get me the crash cart? Versus in thin air communication, such as, I need a crash cart. So in terms of other individual errors, we noticed that people would often be blind to certain changes in the environments. They wouldn't see that the patient had gotten into VT. And so when one person noticed it and said it to the other, they actually didn't make that successful communication. So one doctor would say, oh, the patient's in VT, and the other doctor just didn't realize that, wasn't paying attention. Sometimes they just get the diagnosis wrong. So perhaps it's a condition which most doctors don't see in their lifetimes, and they think it's something which is much more common. Sometimes they get the algorithms wrong. So perhaps they shock and then check for the pulse instead of doing CPR immediately. Or perhaps they're compressing too slowly or not deep enough. And one thing we also noticed is that they lose time and they just do things late. So actually in one of the scenarios we watched, for this condition, which isn't that common, one of the doctors actually pulled out their iPhone and started looking up on some medical database what was going on. And it actually took them, on the order of minutes rather than seconds to refer to this database. So this is something which can hopefully be improved upon. So in terms of what we do as technologists or as human-computer interaction specialists, we thought a lot about how might we do better. In what ways can you understand these existing work processes and use technology to make these processes better? So we thought, how might we improve the adoption of the checklists and aids? So we watched dozens of doctors go through these scenarios, but even though they were trained in their residency by a specific anesthesiologist to use cognitive aids, not everyone uses these aids in practice. So maybe only half of them pull it out part of the time. And it's something where, depending on the institution, depending on the person, they may choose to use it or not use it. There's lots of different social factors. Do they appear that they're losing authority, for example, when they pull out these aids? So that's something where perhaps technology can help. So something we haven't studied yet specifically, but maybe a factor is that, do you appear more authoritative if you pull out a tablet versus a paper display, which some of our interviews may suggest. How might you make these aids really easy to access? So we watched doctors as they were going through these crises, and sometimes they would pull out the aids, but then they would put them down. And so people have observed, you put the aids down, you put other things on top of it, you kind of hold it in one hand. It's something where just having this paper is not a very kind of usable form factor for this really complex environments. How can you also design these aids to be quickly assimilated? So in these crises, you don't have very much time, and you want to make them so that you can actually absorb the information. So the analogy from kind of mobile interaction is, how do you get driving directions? So back in the day, you just get MapQuest step-by-step directions. But now with GPS, now that it knows where you are, it can give you turn-by-turn. And it turns out that in that research, you can actually spend less time looking at what the next step is because it's more contextualized. And this is also an area where lots of different design comes into play. For example, the actual cost of using the aid can be broken down into the visual cost of finding the aid and parsing it, then the cognitive cost of understanding it, and some of the interaction costs. So if you can kind of change these cost structures, perhaps you can make it more common for doctors to actually pull out and then absorb this information. And then finally, you have these situations where the doctors don't have very much time or attention. Can you actually engineer the interaction and the design so that it works under these limited time frames?
So are these aids mainly used by whoever's sort of situationally in control at the moment? Is there a reason why that would need to be the case? Why not have someone else in the room responsible for tracking whether or not you're sticking to the script?
So that's a really good question. So in aviation, you have co-pilots where they have a very standardized routine for kind of do check protocols. So during takeoff, the co-pilot may say, rudders check, aileron check or whatever. And in medicine, it's more complicated because you have much more complicated team dynamics. So in medicine, unlike aviation, you have all these people with very different training and cultures, so nurses and doctors and even different specialties. And so in terms of who actually gets to own the aid, kind of does determine kind of social factors. So for example, people have researched what happens if you introduce this reader role where a resident or a doctor starts saying like 5 minutes of the code, they say, well, here's a piece of paper, it might be useful. And then 10 minutes in the code, they say, oh, look, this is a paper relevant to this specific scenario. I'm going to read it out loud. And so it turns out that people have studied the use of these readers in codes, and it's a useful, effective thing. But then it's a question of who gets the authority. So like, if you're reading what should be done, are you then directing what needs to be done? And so that's partly why perhaps these reader roles have not been widely adopted yet, is because there's no clear standard of who actually reads these aids, who's in power, and how are they accessed. So I think it's a very interesting question, which also affects our design. So I'll talk a little bit later about how we designed the system so that doctors still felt in control, even though other people may be helping out with them. So we did a pretty long design process. We had the help of a lot of undergraduates over the course of 2 summers working on this. So in the first summer, after kind of watching these anesthesiologists, we kind of started this design prototyping process. And so thinking of these prototypes as a kind of conversation with the doctors. So we would build prototypes, kind of non-interactive, kind of sketchy ones with paper or Keynote. And then on a week-by-week basis, we go in, kind of get their feedback and kind of walk through these things. So sometimes we go into the simulator and do these kind of design charrettes and say, okay, you're in this particular scenario. Here is the technological version of your existing paper aids. Is this actually useful? So as part of this kind of prototyping loop, it's sort of this design, build, and then kind of simulate loop, which I kind of hope will kind of affect how medical research is done. So just this past year, the first paper using high-fidelity medical simulation was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a pretty big deal. So for a long time, people haven't used kind of simulations to inform how doctors practice. But now that this paper was published, looking at specifically checklists and cognitive aids, hopefully more doctors will kind of investigate simulation. And as technologists, it provides us a great opportunity to get in there and actually iterate and try things out at a much lower cost. So instead of going to a hospital and having to deal with all the privacy concerns and having to watch videos and then delete them 12 hours later, as is the practice, you can actually kind of go with this loop in a much faster way. So this is a little bit about how the ORs are set up. So we observed mainly anesthesiologist residents working in the OR. So how this works is that the anesthesiologist is in charge of perioperative patient care. So let's say a surgeon is doing things, they're probably in control, but if something goes wrong, like the plane starts going down is kind of analogy, the anesthesiologist is kind of like the pilot. So they're in charge of like takeoff and landing, and if something goes wrong. So let's say the patient starts hemorrhaging, or the patient's heart becomes tachycardic. The anesthesiologist usually is the one that steps in and kind of takes control of the situation. So the anesthesiologist on the right, let's say she's kind of looking at the patient from the top of the head of the display. So as part of our process, we built our interactive systems for these cognitive aids so that they could be used from multiple perspectives. So to address this issue of access, we built displays which were not only on large screens, but mounted on carts, which would come in. And so this is kind of like a stadium display, where if you're in a stadium, you can see with the action from wherever things are going on. But it also gives you this idea of the kind of complexity of this environment. And I think as an HI researcher, it's a really interesting field, because in comparison to office work, you have, you may even have a dozen people in a complex cardiac code that have very different training that are trying to do multiple things in the same co-located situation. So it gets really complex in the number of devices and the number of people in these environments. So after our design process, this is kind of what we came up with in terms of some of the form factors. So we experimented with putting stuff on the wall. The disadvantage of that is that doctors weren't always looking at the wall. They were often kind of going back and forth between the patient field and the vitals display / anesthesia machine and some of the drug carts. So instead, we tried mounting the displays on this crash cart. So if doctors call code blue in the OR or in the hospital, then nurses will bring in this crash cart, which has the defibrillators and epinephrine. So we just put this large display in there and also provided this kind of tablet interaction. This is one of the doctors looking at it. So we designed this system, and we built it so that it could be accessed from multiple places in the room. So because we had multiple displays, we then synchronized the interaction across the displays using WebSockets for these really low latency synchronization. So to address some of these concerns of who gets in control, because everyone can see it, and in theory everyone can control it, but in our system we're trying to encourage people to use the tablets to control it. This makes it so that the doctors feel that they're in control. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the idea is that we're essentially giving the doctors in charge kind of voice command interface into this so that they can tell the nurse or the technician or even the other doctor that's controlling the tablet, can you bring up the aid for malignant hypothermia? So, okay, we deploy this in the simulator, so that's just me. Um, and I got to put on scrubs and operate the system in simulation. And some of the things we learned from actually putting it in the simulator and trying it out with anesthesia residents was that we really needed to make it always ready. So doctors wouldn't use it if they had to spend a lot of time configuring and setting it up. So the idea is if it's still useful before the crisis happens, perhaps they'll kind of keep on using it. So because the doctors were often busy, we gave the nurse, or in this case, that was the kind of technician, this primary control, which is synchronized. And finally, we have this kind of big display. So as part of this design process, one of the kind of unexpected insights was this kind of shift from thinking of it as a cognitive aid to something which is more enticing to doctors. So if you think about what doctors want, they want to access and manage the resources, and that includes their time, but it also includes information and people. So you'll see later in some of the design of the systems, but we designed it so that they would think of this system as a way to access resources which are useful to them, and that would hopefully incentivize them to use it.
Does this mean that you backed off from the goal of making it a checklist?
So we did back off from making it kind of a step-by-step checklist. So when you think of checklists, you often think of something where you need to execute every step in lockstep order. But one thing we noticed was that when doctors use these aids, they use them in kind of a nonlinear fashion. So sometimes they would pick it up and skim it. Sometimes they would kind of huddle together and try to determine something that was going on. And sometimes they'd be this kind of Hail Mary where doctors would just, kind of go through things at the last minute because they're not sure what's going on. So we tried to make it so it's more flexible as a system. And so think of it as an aid system broadly. We incorporated checklists into the system, but they were just one resource that people could call upon, and something where they didn't have to click things step by step to go to the next step. So in terms of putting this in the simulator, one thing we realized quickly is that doctors don't have very much time. And so a lot of our earlier prototypes were a lot more complicated. So this is kind of midway. Well, I guess I'll show that later. So if you actually look at where do doctors look in some of these simulations, we mounted a head-mounted camera on one of the anesthesiologists and kind of tracked, where is this head-mounted camera looking as a proxy for their gaze and attention. And we went and kind of coded what they were doing and what they were looking at, and kind of looked at, this is like 6 minutes. And so it's something where they're kind of looking back and forth, not necessarily spending very much time looking at a single thing. And this is something where they would kind of be going back and forth between these different items. But the takeaway is that if you actually plot these gaze lengths and kind of sort them, you get a sense of how do doctors spend their time in some of these crises. So most of these gaze times are actually pretty short. So a lot of times are less than 5 or 6 seconds. So this is actually kind of supported by other research in the field, where people have looked at, how often do doctors look at vital sign monitors? So most of their looks are less than, 3 seconds in this case. Other people were looking at head-mounted displays, and they said how much do they spend looking at these workstations that, so anesthesiologists will look at these workstations to determine how drugs are getting infused and so on. And so again, it's about 3.7 seconds. In a completely unrelated field, people looked at mobile HCI and said, oh, you have these kind of 4-second interaction bursts. So it's something about kind of this number where whether you're in a hurry or you're a doctor, you really want to design for these kind of short, kind of bursty things, which is not what we expected. It also goes back to the kind of checklist approach. If you're only going to be looking at it at 4-second bursts, it's not necessarily a checklist in the sense that you're going to go through it and spend a minute looking at it. So this is one of our earlier designs. You can say it's a little bit busier, has a bit more color. We're experimenting with putting the vital signs in the lower left to kind of draw their eye. We explored a lot of the kind of timeline and giving doctors information about what has happened in the past on the left. So, for example, if we could automatically track drug injections and vital signs, we could track that and provide that to the doctors and say, now you're doing this. We also had information about, supplies. Here's some of the, EMR sort of things. We were giving them information about the patient. One thing that the doctors actually suggested and really liked was, if you look in the top right, there's actually information about people in the room. So if you're in a small hospital, maybe you know everyone who's on your code team. but oftentimes you're called into the code and you don't necessarily know everyone on your shifts. So it actually turns out that doctors really like this idea of seeing who's in the room. So you could use, for example, smart name badges, and people have done some research in studying these things to provide information about who's in the room and what are they doing. So if you're coming to a code situation, someone is going into cardiac arrest in the hospital wing, the doctors will kind of rush in there and they're getting paged in, but they don't know who's the patient, so they send an intern to run for the medical documents, and then they don't know, is there a cardiologist here? Can they get a cardio consult? So it's really, really messy. So if it's something where you can automatically surface this information about who's in the room and what can they do, but not only that, some of the prototypes explore this notion of leadership. Can you specify this person is a team leader? So in practice, some people put on hats or coats or stand on something a little bit taller to signify that they're the leader, because it kind of simplifies how this works. But going back to the attention piece, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And as we iterated, we kind of started realizing that the doctors wanted to see what was going on right now. And so we started to narrow our focus into something that's much more like turn by turn. So as you're driving, it only tells you what you need to do now. And so in this interface, it'll say, okay, now you're going to defibrillate 200 joules. What has happened in the past, what's going to happen in the future, you can look at it later, but we're just trying to focus their attention. And here you have the team lead kind of aspect, and it's a little bit more desaturated to not use color if you don't have to. So in terms of thinking about this, we're thinking of this not just a cognitive aid, but this kind of more dynamic kind of procedural aid. So it is something where it's dynamic because the system can perhaps infer what's going on, or perhaps other doctors can say, we're at this point in the treatment step, and so everyone is on the same page and they don't have to spend time looking for this information. So I'm going to show you a little video of how this might actually work in practice. So in this version, the doctor is actually using the tablet themselves, but we've also experimented with this condition where someone else is using it. Just for this video, it turned out it looked better if they were using it. But this is kind of a simulated code where they're making use of this digital system. In this one, you don't have the large screen display on the wall, but this is basically investigating what happens if you put the displays on the crash cart and make this sort of crash cart 2.0. So always busy.
Hey Carl, what's going on?
This guy just coded on it.
Yeah? Tell me the story.
I just found him in I think it's an 8 distillate. You got the milligram?
Okay, well, it looks like with Mr. Steiner, he was bradycardic. It looks like they tried transportation, it didn't work. Kyle, have you guys given epinephrine yet?
We just gave a milligram of epinephrine? Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks like it's about time to redose for a couple minutes. Have you done a rhythm check?
No, not yet.
Okay, guys, let's stop CPR just so we can do a rhythm check. Okay, that looks like ventricular fibrillation. Kyle, let's get ready to defibrillate. Continue decompression. All right. And a continue mass ventilation.
Yeah, defibrillate. Everyone clear. All right.
Okay, continue CPR.
So that kind of gives you this idea of how frantic it might be. The music is kind of obviously intended to convey the kind of energy. But it turns out, operating rooms are really noisy. So people are usually playing music. If it's the surgeon will put on whatever kind of Billy Joel that he likes. And usually they turn it off when crisis happens. But there's all these things beeping. People are talking to each other. All these noises. It's something where, if you think about it from the interaction perspective, one reason we didn't do audio is because it is an overloaded channel. But this kind of gives you a sense of how some of the design challenges and kind of interaction challenges of having multiple displays and multiple people and this kind of multi-surface design environments. So walking through it, these are just some of the kind of aspects of the system. So by making it dynamic, we're only focusing their information on what they need to do now. So here, they need to do CPR, a specific rate and frequency. It actually turns out people do really bad CPR. So most people don't compress at 100 beats per minute, and if you actually track, even people who are trained, they actually spend a lot of time not compressing. So this is something where if you can then track these things and have it be part of the aid, hopefully you can improve adherence. You have, again, this large screen display, and something that we haven't studied yet in terms of does this display actually increase the shared mental model and then performance, but perhaps in future studies we can study how does this impact performance. And then finally, this kind of mirrored display where you can kind of separate the interaction, so the technician can operate it or the doctor can operate it, and the team can benefit from all the information. So just kind of summing up the high-level approach of this design is that we built it for ready access. So there are shared displays. It's always on. It's not something that you just pull out in the case of only emergencies. We designed it to be quickly assimilated. So I won't go into some of the design work that goes into compressing text and the visual design, but basically you can make these kind of stereotype structures or design it so that information can be parsed really quickly without as much text. And then third, acceptance. So really focusing on how can you design it so that you can incentivize people to access these resources at a glance. And then finally, attention. So focusing information, having this dynamic interface is important. So I'm going to walk through some of the, just an example of dynamic aid, just to show what the interface that we designed looked like. So again, you see in the top right the people in the room and their roles. You can access services or help. You want to call for a crash card, EKG. On the bottom right, the patient information. On the left, you have, this is some of the aids that we were initially implementing. So we focused on what they call advanced cardiac life support, which basically all doctors receive training in, usually in their last years of their medical school, and they get retrained on a regular basis. So this is what happens if someone has cardiac arrest, their pulse becomes really fast or erratic. So we provide some information sent by showing some of the rhythms so that people can kind of match the rhythms. So let's say in this condition, they click on VTAC and they go on, or VFib. So again, we're showing this visual information sense. We're showing some of the important things in terms of compressions and depth. We're showing the rotating compressors, because it turns out people get tired and then their compression gets worse. And then the situation progresses, they need to defibrillate 200 joules and then resume CPR immediately. And then some of the advantages of software are once you defibrillate into CPR, you can then have automated drug timers. So because you may lose track of time, if you can then either sense it or manually input it, you can have these timers. So the question becomes, this is really interesting design work, kind of observation and understanding the domain, but does it actually work? Can we actually show that certain design choices or certain implementations or certain aspects of the environment, is it actually feasible to have doctors use technological aids? And because it's not yet common practice to use technological aids, we kind of wanted to understand the kind of feasibility and does our aspects of our system work? And one of the challenges becomes, how do you rapidly get feedback on these approaches? So observing the simulation is something we could do very cheaply, but actually intervening is pretty expensive. So if you think about all the people time, the space time, being able to do these kind of randomized controlled trials, that's really expensive in terms of renting out the space in the med school. So we started looking at more kind of engineering level or kind of really fast tests of understanding how doctors actually use these interfaces under stress. So I'm not going to go into detail about the study design, but we use this kind of screen-based simulators as part of this, we call it a medium fidelity simulation approach. So in low fidelity simulation, you often use just screens by themselves, and you have doctors sit down and just use them. So it turns out that that is useful in understanding and being able to teach doctors, but when it comes to some of these non-technical skills like communication, management, using cognitive aids, just having one screen doesn't work. So we expanded this to this multi-screen kind of medium fidelity approach. So what we did is we designed a scenario which would advance in lockstep with our interface. So it wouldn't branch at all. And one of the advantages of this is that it's a very low-cost thing to do. So you have these parallel screenshots essentially advancing, and you have the doctors respond to these situations in real time. So doctors would have to answer questions like, what is your next step, or how should you dose epinephrine, or like how often should you dose it. Here we had there was a simulated patient which wasn't there in the actual study, and the patient who was here, the doctor was kind of looking at the screen and also taking care of the secondary task. So there's a lot more to the study, but I'll kind of go into what the takeaways were. And the basic takeaway is that we looked at how much did people deviate from the protocol. So we had our medical doctors kind of define the kind of correct answers and the correct protocol, and then we went through and kind of coded the responses based on did they follow this protocol. So in a sense, this overestimates the some of the errors, or perhaps it's a different class of errors. So for example, certain drugs, so doctors have specific preferences about what drugs they like to use or not use, even though the protocol says use drug X. Some doctors say, well, I don't really like the effectiveness of that. So some of these errors are kind of that noise of people have their own specific preferences. Some of these errors are just they didn't respond to the questions in time. So even we gave them 10 seconds and so even though some of the decisions you can wait for longer than 10 seconds, we marked it as an error if they just didn't respond within the time frame. So if you look at it, kind of close to a third was marked as an error of these responses. So we had these kind of 10-minute long scenarios. And we had this design, Latin square design, where the three conditions were having no aid, being unaided, being exposed to paper aids, which they have had training using different paper aids, but not necessarily these aids, and then our kind of software-based aids. So for the paper aids, we used existing paper aids. These are actually the ones that were studied both in that New England Journal of Medicine paper and some other papers, where they've shown that teams of crisis responders do better when you code them based on their performance if you give them aids versus unaided. So in this situation, we gave them the aids, but we didn't mandate their use because that seemed more realistic. But it turns out in our study that there wasn't very much difference between the people that received the paper aids and the people that were unaided. And some of that may be that they weren't trained enough on these aids. So people often reported, I'm used to the American Heart Association kind of style of aids. So they have a certain mental model of how they think about the kind of, CPR, dosed epinephrine, check loop. And they think of this specific flow chart, which is in the AHA. Whereas in these aids, maybe it's expressed in text, or maybe the guidelines are slightly different. So it may be that if people receive more training, or if the time constraints weren't as severe, presumably people would do better with the paper aids, but that's not what we found in our limited study. Again, so we, about 30 participants looked at medical students, residents, fellows, and when we compared it with a condition where they had our dynamic aid, they did quite a bit better. So again, these aren't necessarily significant medical errors, so that was a fairly smaller fraction of these. So in terms of what errors would actually are kind of egregious versus what is something where you you pulse check instead of doing a call it like a rhythm check or something. So kind of just wrapping up, kind of describe some of our design work, some of our engineering implementation work, and kind of building out the system and trying it out. And then I kind of briefly touched upon some of the experimental results. So Jesse, who's going to be talking later this quarter, will do a much deeper dive into this study and also a newer study, which we've done, looking at kind of timing and gaze. But here I'll just talk about kind of summarizing what we found, and also just talking about what the vision of this project was. So how this project started was Larry Chu from anesthesiology came to us and kind of gave a talk at the HI group and was kind of excited about this idea of making cognitive aids more interactive. And because it is a kind of fairly new research area in medicine, that's something where we thought, as technologists, can we intervene and kind of speed the adoption of this technology? Can we kind of skip a generation and make aids easier to use, but also get them distributed across the world? So something with paper aids, the publication cycles are really long. It's hard to access. It's something where, with digital distribution, you can obviously hopefully do a lot better. So this is kind of a vision of where this project might be going. So here's the simulated operation. You have someone doing CPR. In the back, you can have the simulated wall screen display. Maybe it'll even take up a whole wall. And then in comes our crash cart 2.0. So this has the kind of mounted display on it. It has the tablet interface, something where doctors can kind of, as they're accessing these kind of drug resources, they can call upon medical information. They can see perhaps, can you show me the ultrasound, or show me the patient history. Did this person have a history of kidney failure or something? And then again, kind of the tablet display. Something which isn't necessarily clear is, of these form factors, how will doctors actually use them? So do they prefer kind of smaller handheld displays? Or will they be more likely to use kind of phone-sized displays? So something we're hoping to experiment with over the summer is kind of even the next step. So maybe you've seen people walking around Mountain View with these glasses. I know I have. It's a little freaky, but here they are. So can you do something like this guy over here? And what's next after the stethoscope? Can you provide information to doctors kind of on demand? And I'm going to just briefly show the previous video in kind of this vision format of how let's see. So here's what it might look like if if we had a glass, which we might, TBA. So again, it's something where using this information, you can get information about who's in the room, but because it's on the glass, you don't have to look away to access it.
I just found him in the
Again, it's something where when you go into the room, you don't have to send people off to get the information display. I'll just turn out the volume, and you can just access it based on the information that's in the room. So whether you're in an OR or a hospital wing, you can get that information. And again, this is where some of the interactive. This is where some of the interactivity comes in. So if you can, for example, sense compressions, either using devices. So some people have built iPhone-based compression tools, which will sense using accelerometers. Or if you can sense using auditory or visual sensing, you can then get a sense of first how often and how quickly people are ventilating. So it's actually very common for people to overventilate, which is bad, and for people to undercompress, which is also bad. And so these things seem really simple, but if you can then sense them and provide feedback to the team leader in this case, you can hopefully make a difference. And then finally, besides resources, you can also access kind of this dynamic aid information about the protocol. So what should you do now? Something where you can kind of make sure you're on the right track. And then, okay, oh, they save the patient. Yeah.
Do you have any insight in how you would actually automatically put the right information on such a small display?
Our first approach was just to use people power, and because it's synchronized, oftentimes there's already a recorder role, so a nurse is already recording what gets injected when. So they're saying, okay, I did epinephrine at 3:42, and the doctor will ask, how long since last epinephrine? And the nurse will say, oh, it's been 3 minutes, it's okay to redose. So something where there actually are roles already for data entry. So we imagine that's the first approach would be to have these kind of other people in the room access the information. people talk a lot about kind of AI, but actually I think what will happen before AI is the role of the crowd and kind of remote work in medical hospitals. So because the cost of having doctors actually here is so high, you can imagine, for example, if you were remote, you actually may be able to provide better feedback. So it turns out if you're standing outside the OR situation looking in, things seem very calm, whereas people inside, they don't always appear calm, and when they come out, they talk about how it seemed more stressful. So it's something where with crowd work, if you could, for example, have a platform for secure crowd work where doctors could then help out, it's something where they could kind of direct things. So it's kind of analogous to the air traffic controller, where someone is kind of watching and then directing. And so perhaps that would also help with having doctors not stay up all the time and so on. And then obviously, finally, the next step would be both UV comp sensing and kind of inference based on that. So if you can then instrument all these devices, you can get a sense of what's going on, and then do kind of prediction based on, if someone injected dopamine, then they're probably giving an infusion, and if the EKG rhythm is, a certain is like tachycardic, then perhaps it's more likely that this aid is more common, and so you can suggest consider, this other infusion at this rate instead. I noticed that you were infusing at 10x what you should be doing. So does that answer your question?
I can see that these dynamic cognitive aids would be really helpful, accessible, as you say, large screen, they can be sequential and follow the protocol with time. But to the extent that you have interactive checklists as part of the cognitive aid, have you looked into the error rate for data entry in a very high stress time? So, the doctor says, oh, the nurse will input that because, oops, blood pressure going down, I got to treat the patient. Without a real designated data inputter, and then even with one, as he was saying, error rates in self-reports and in input. It seems like you might be generating other kinds of errors with dynamic checklists.
This is true. I think with respect to input error, we didn't do a lot of observation with understanding, how quickly could people write these things down or record them. But just in our observation process, we observed a lot of communication error, and so that may even trump this kind of input error. But you're right in saying that there may be a different class of errors with this technology. For example, if someone brings up an aid, but it's the wrong aid, does that lead people down the wrong path? And with respect to inputs, I guess the hope is that if you can make it more visible, you can then service some of these errors. So the difficulty with communication errors is that it's just into the air, and it's not necessarily to specific people or to getting logged somewhere. So if instead, when the nurse is doing input or logging, it then gets shown in the big display, the doctor can kind of double check that. So I guess the whole principle is to kind of surface and make visible those possible errors. But we don't have that much time left, so I guess wrap up. That's the video link for the sketch of how you might work with a heads-up display. But just wanted to thank my collaborators, so Jesse, the doctors Larry and Kyle, Stu, Scott, and Pat, although were really helpful in this project. And I guess I'll open up for other questions.
One thing I noticed was that everybody in the room was wearing latex gloves except the person wearing the iPad, because I assume that it's not very easy to work the iPad with gloves on. Does that also kind of tie into having one person that's really in charge of working with the cognitive aid, the same way that you have one person being in charge of recording things?
Yeah, and maybe that in terms of the team environment, that's what ends up happening. So it turns out, for example, to be an anesthesiologist, you don't necessarily have to be as the you don't have to care as much about some of the sanitation as the person who's actually, hands-on the patient. So you're typically, for example, if you're the team leader, maybe you are telling people to inject drugs, telling people to do CPR. So it's okay if you're not wearing latex gloves. So it actually turns out that you can buy kind of plastic bags for your iPad, which you can get for these situations where they're just disposable and they actually work through that. But yeah, I guess he probably just didn't have time. It was just kind of simulating you're just coming to this emergency and you're probably not going to have the gloves because you're not in the operation. So.
In your mid-fidelity simulation, I wasn't clear whether it was an individual that you were assessing or if there was a group, and how many, whether it was a team of one or a team of more, how many teams you had, and whether you saw a lot of variation across teams in the way they used the aids or the paper and so on.
So for this study, we just looked at individuals, and about 30-ish, and they had an experience range from med students to residents and fellows. So the people with more experience tended to do better, and there was a range in terms of who used the aids. So one fellow said, I don't need these aids, and so they put them behind them, and just kind of refused to use the paper aids. And some people kind of would always be holding on to them, kind of using them a lot. So there was kind of a wide range of how people use the aids, and that kind of matched what we observed in the simulation.
And could you, I know, so that'd be like 10 people per technology type?
So we did a within subjects design. So each person, there's 3 different scenarios, and each participant was exposed to all the 3 conditions in some order.
Did you look at all as to whether there was any relationship to use of the aid and individual performance? So you might choose not to use the aid because in fact you have done exactly this 5,000 times and you're correct in assessing that you don't need it, or you could not use the aid because you're too arrogant to, or whatever unhelpful reason. Could you look at whether there was any relationship? Did people who use the aids do better, or it made no effect? Could you see anything?
We're coding that data right now. So, or we just coded it and we're analyzing that now. So we tracked how often people would look and refer to the aids, and people actually looked at the digital aids a lot. But we're right now still analyzing, for example, does the subset that uses aids in general do better? There may be lots of different confounds in terms of experience level and exposure to aids, but we're definitely starting to analyze the effect of whether or not people choose to use these aids.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation, thank you. This is kind of in the setting of crisis management, or like the music, the dramatic moments. When you look at the studies that report errors in hospitals that lead to tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths a year, it's commonly in the mundane or daily thing, the ordering of a medication or something on a routine basis. So I'm just wondering if your group has thought about application of these aids and devices for the non-crisis situation, but for the mundane situation, and looking at outcome measures in that setting as well.
I think it's an interesting suggestion to try to kind of port back some of these results, because it may be that, in the sense that if you're studying multiple people and multiple services, you can then inform kind of less critical tasks, perhaps by studying this emergency domain in medicine under time constraints, you can then design it for kind of more routine care situations. So in the situations, you might expect that they're still stressed and they still don't have a lot of time, but it's kind of a different level of stress and different level of time constraint. And I would imagine that some of the insights would still be useful. For example, having multiple displays, having things where information is visible, and also having kind of intelligent information subsets and kind of useful visual design. And so it's something where I think, in medicine, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of visual information design and also interaction design. And what we're hoping with some of this work is to show the importance of kind of visual information and interaction design, so that in these situations where you can really quickly assess the impacts, then you can then go back and say, okay, now for putting in central lines or for drug dosing, if you do this in simulation or in practice, does that actually lead to measurably different outcomes? So it's something where hopefully this stuff will get out there. We're actually talking with some companies that are trying to get displays into hospitals, and they're kind of interested in getting this kind of content out there.
So I'm trying to figure out how quickly you can eliminate doctors from this situation, because have you thought about having an automated and a non-automated system, and how close are we to that? So for some things like BFib, it's clearly there's a standard system for dealing with BFib. You don't really need a doctor, you just need a machine to plug in the drugs and shock at the right moment. But then, you get a little more complicated things, maybe you need to turn off the automatic system. And so have you thought about being able to switch the system between automatic with the doctor being able to override it versus non-automatic?
I think it's definitely interesting to think about this automated, non-animated thing. So one condition where this comes up is if you look specifically, for example, at defibrillating, a lot of the doctors don't necessarily set the right mode for the defibrillator. And it's something where the instructors will say something like, oh, you should be able to tell the EKG rhythm without using the machine because you can do it faster. So this is kind of tension between having the doctor's judgment, which is kind of really fast and inform my judgment, versus the automated approaches, which have the disadvantages of sometimes being slower, sometimes being more brutal, and also, not necessarily exposing their state. So one thing people run into is having alarms which keep on going. And I think if that's a situation where people have already tried to do a lot of automation, where people will have automated alarms, and then doctors inevitably just end up turning off that, turn off that alarm. So I think it's something where you kind of have to really be careful about putting all your eggs in the automation basket, because it's very easy for those kind of brittle systems to go off the wrong path and start alarming. And with automated input, one of the big challenges is actually the sensing. So because the alarms don't necessarily know the provenance or the quality of the data, they alarm anyway, right? So that the monitors don't necessarily know that it's not connected to the patient or that it's misconfigured. So I think there's definitely a lot of these challenges which need to be addressed. And I think once sensing technology gets better, I think that is when a lot of the automation will start happening more often. So, Chinmay?
Okay, Leslie, so I think you've made a really great case that it's great for patients and it will save a lot of lives. I'm wondering whether it will also make doctors more accountable, because you're checking things off. You can say that you did it, even, do you see that as a major advantage of this, or are doctors really more?
Hopefully. I mean, some doctors will say that if you're designing this system, you want to design it, what do they say? They want to know, well, one of the things which is important for doctors is how do they get paid, obviously, right? So if you can, for example, tie the system into the billing, so then the doctor can say, you must use this checklist, and you can then demonstrate that you performed the procedure, then you get paid.
Yeah.
Or even from an accountability perspective, you can go back and look, did you do the right thing? Which is also a double-edged sword. So if you do the wrong thing, maybe you want to delete the data, or you just don't want to save it. So I think it gets complicated, but I think definitely one of the important truths that not people believe in, or there's this thought about kind of what should you do with checklists. And one thing which I haven't seen people propose, but I think is important, is that it would be great if checklists were not only interactive, but essentially recorded the data to the government. So it turns out that, so we all know that healthcare in the US is really expensive and not necessarily effective. But it turns out that there is a subset of medicine and healthcare which is really effective, and that's the Army. And so it turns out that because Army hospitals and all their doctors record and report their data, they can actually do science and iterate. And so in my vision of the world, you have these interactive checklist software deployed, and perhaps they are anonymized, but if you can then track what gets done and the outcome, that would be really valuable for medical research. Because right now, maybe the individual hospital knows or the chain knows, but it's not really aggregated in the same way that, for example, aviation does it. So there's no authority which collects all important medical errors and then does analysis to improve that.
So I guess as a follow-up, given that we have no FAA for medicine, what do you think is the next best thing that you can do without governmental, because you can complain that Congress doesn't work, so we've got to do something to it.
Presumably it will be some kind of smaller hospital or set of hospitals that says, okay, we're going to adopt this technology. So we talked with, there's some people building a whole bunch of hospitals in India, or maybe a specific set of hospitals in the US where they say, we're going to adopt this and then we're going to show that this actually has a clinically important difference. And then I think with medicine, it's something where it can be slow to change, but once the right people get on board and certain people decide it kind of changes very quickly. So hopefully if you can kind of start small and show some of these differences, then that'll kind of propagate.
I'm wondering now, modernly, how well do medical devices interface with each other? Is there some standardized output like XML or JSON or something? And how technically challenging is it to do something seemingly simple, like displaying all the output of every medical device on one screen?
I think that's usually kind of a big interoperability challenge from what I understand. I know that there's a lot of work now in understanding the security of wireless mobile health devices, and there is some work at Harvard looking specifically at standardizing EMRs. But as far as sensing, I don't know if people are trying to build like the USB of medical sensing. But that would be useful. I currently don't know the state of that in practice. I guess the hope would be if you have some kind of central place where the data gets into, then that would kind of be one step. So if you're, for example, Epic or Practice Fusion, and you say that, okay, you're all going to communicate with me in this way, presumably in 10 or 20 years, you'll be able to get that data.
Kind of a connected question to that is, if you could have any hardware you want, even hardware that doesn't exist yet, what would you want? No, not just for take home, but sure.
I would love to thank.
I guess that's a very broad question. I guess when it comes to checklists or cognitive aids, I think something with sensing would be pretty important. So being able to tell what doctors are in the room are doing and saying, I think could probably drive innovation as to what has been going on. And so, for example, I guess maybe my answer would be I would want a black box for medicine. So in aviation, all planes must have a black box so that when they go down, they investigate it. So it would be, I want a mandatory black box for medicine where it records in some privacy conscious way what goes on. And then if something does go wrong, or even if it does go right, then it kind of reports back to the hospital, to some bigger institution, just so that this kind of evidence-based medicine actually is what people end up doing.
Right, so it seems like the data input and then the data logging, these two things, and like the kind of output display stuff is good enough at the moment.
Yeah.
So I can see two broad cases for when checklists are useful. One is the very, very common case where you have this very low probability event that I missed something that later cascaded into a big problem, and I got overconfident that I know what I'm doing. And another case is a situation where we veered off the rails into a world that I'm less familiar with. This is like the plane is on its way down. You know, you don't want to pull out that checklist, but you do because it's the best way to help you get through it. Do you have a sense of, you know, if you agree with that typology, which of the two is going to be more beneficial in medicine?
It's a good question. I think there's a comment about this a little bit earlier. I think if you argue that some of these errors compound, then you want to catch them earlier. And so you could catch them like as you're about to shock the patient, but if you, for example, realize that the patient had a latex allergy earlier, then that error wouldn't have happened. So I would basically say that in terms of impact, it's a strange thing in medicine where a lot of the funding and attention understandably goes to the last minutes and days and hours, but the kind of earlier you get along the process, like before surgery starts or even before the patient is there. So for example, there's a movement to do patient-centered checklists, not only for the hospital, but kind of your life. So like I check into meditating every day. And so if it's something where you can have checklists kind of back propagate into how people live their lives, I think the further you go back there, the kind of greater the cost savings. But the harder it is to invest in and the longer it takes to evaluate. So it may end up being that you start at this crisis tail end, so things which take like, which kind of turn over really quickly. So like, central line infection, you can probably detect really quickly, or things which are an order of like hours or days. And then you take that and you kind of back propagate it to more routine and then everyday life.
And most of your field work so far has been in crisis situations.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. People to do better surgeries. So it has very simple things such as before you start the surgery, do you do a timeout? Is it the right patients? Is it the right procedure? Is it the right side? And then you go through all these pre-surgical safety timeouts. But similar checklists have actually been shown to make big differences in outcomes. So in 10-day trials looking at central lines, it drastically changes infection rates. And in other multi-site trials, you can really change lives and save lots of money. But in contrast, medicine is still kind of evolving as a field. Unlike in aviation, there's no kind of central body which records all medical errors and records everything which happens. So this is an example of what you might see in a hospital OR, where doctors may just kind of go and write down some of these information by hands that may help them during their tasks. Here's a more formalized version which they use at Stanford. So if you're at an institution like Stanford or Harvard Medical School, you'll be trained in the use of these checklists, and they call them more broadly cognitive aids during your training. So this particular cognitive aid addresses the condition of pulseless electrical activity, and it kind of walks you through things you should check and make sure you don't miss, as well as things that you should think about during the treatment protocol. So how do these cognitive aids help when they do help? So if you think about it, they're an aid to not only memory, but attention. So oftentimes, if you're called into code, perhaps you haven't done this procedure in a month or a year. There's also procedures which most doctors don't see in their lifetimes. And are you going to remember the right procedures that you want to do from your medical training? So besides memory, it's also an attention aid. Are you attending to the right things in this right moment? So we know that during stress, your attention narrows and your cognitive processes get more limited. And so these external cognitive aids essentially put knowledge into the world rather than keeping them in your brain. They also help with training. So they kind of define these mental schema so that both novices and experts can kind of go back and refer to them and keep up to date with what changes in medicine. And one might argue that cognitive aids may help teams maintain a shared mental model. If you pull out the aid, do you know what procedure we're doing? Are you on the kind of same page? And it's been shown in aviation that shared mental models can increase team performance. And finally, when you talk about individual performance, one doctor said that you really want these aids to raise up the level of these lowest performers. So maybe people who are less experienced or are working on something which is not their specialty. You want to kind of raise these people up to the average. So as part of our design process, we spent some time observing this anesthesia crisis resource management class. So this is adapted from aviation, where they have these crisis management classes or cockpit resource management classes, where they teach people the kind of soft skills or non-technical skills that they use to work together. For example, how do you delegate and work as a team? How do you anticipate and distribute workload? How do you allocate your attention and use all the resources that you have available? So in this project, we focus specifically on the attentional aspects and on these resources aspects. So these kind of cognitive aids are just one of the resources that doctors can call upon as they're solving problems. So during your medical training, maybe you're sitting in LKSC across the street, kind of paying attention in lecture as you guys have done. But an important part of their training is not just in lecture, but in more realistic situations. So just as in aviation, people will train on simulation for many hours before they graduate, medical doctors are starting to train more in medical simulations. So these are high fidelity medical simulators where doctors actually go in and practice skills such as, how do you pay attention and keep track of all these tasks which are going on in a busy scenario. So pictured here is actually a simulator exact thing. But we saw half a dozen doctors treat that patient very differently in terms of how they diagnosed that patient, how they delegated amongst the team. Did they ask people for heads help in addition to hands help? Did they communicate effectively with other people in the room? For example, did they say, Stu, can you get me the crash cart? Versus in thin air communication, such as, I need a crash cart. So in terms of other individual errors, we noticed that people would often be blind to certain changes in the environments. They wouldn't see that the patient had gotten to VT. And so when one person noticed it and said it to the other, they actually didn't make that successful communication. So one doctor would say, oh, the patient's in VT, and the other doctor just didn't realize that wasn't paying attention. Sometimes they just get the diagnosis wrong. So perhaps it's a condition which most doctors don't see in their lifetimes, and they think it's something which is much more common. Sometimes they get the algorithms wrong. So perhaps they shock and then check for the pulse instead of doing CPR immediately. Or perhaps they're compressing too slowly or not deep enough. And one thing we also noticed is that they lose time and they just do things late. So actually in one of the scenarios we watched, for this condition, which isn't that common, one of the doctors actually pulled out their iPhone and started looking up on some medical database what was going on. And it actually took them on the order of minutes rather than seconds to refer to this database. So this is something which can hopefully be improved upon. So in terms of what we do as technologists or as human-computer interaction specialists, we thought a lot about how might we do better. In what ways can you understand these existing work processes and use technology to make these processes better? So we thought, how might we improve the adoption of the checklists and aids? So we watched dozens of doctors go through these scenarios, but even though they were trained in their So imagine the following scenario. You're a med student or medical doctor in real life. In a hospital, it's 2 a.m. and you're on call. It's really quiet, you don't know who's around, and suddenly there's a code which is called, code blue. You rush into the room and there's half a dozen people, you only know a couple of their names, and you have to figure out, what do you do next? Do you remember what the appropriate drug to inject is? And do you remember the right jewels to set on the defibrillator? Another kind of high impact domain which has these life or death situations is aviation. So in aviation, you also have teams of people working in these tasks which take perhaps a long time, and just as in aviation, you sometimes have hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. And so aviation and medicine have this kind of similar component of having really complex, perilous procedures where really trained professionals have to cope in really fast time demands. And in aviation, one of the tools they use to manage this complexity is checklists. So for several decades now, it's been very standard to use checklists during routine operations and during crises. So when you're taking off, you pull out the checklist. When you're about to crash into the river, you also take out the checklist. It doesn't really matter. So in contrast, in medicine, the use of checklists hasn't been as widely distributed or used. It's something where only now are checklists starting to be used much more commonly during both routine care and in crisis care. So Atul Gawande is one of the people that has kind of popularized and kind of written really cogently about the importance of checklists in medicine. And here's some example of one of the checklists that has been well studied in terms of helping people in the basement of the Lake Hushing building across the streets. And you have people participating in these kind of simulated emergencies. You have these really fantastic and comprehensive medical simulators where everything is real except the patients. You have the gases, you have drugs, you have vials, you have all these things which you can operate on. But the patient is obviously a mannequin. And the mannequin can talk, it can shake, it can emit various bodily fluids at certain points in time. So basically, you kind of forget that you're working with this kind of fake patient. But behind the scenes, there's these kind of dungeon masters or people controlling the situation from behind the scenario. And so here you have David Gaba, who's actually an anesthesiologist here, who pioneered high-fidelity simulation in anesthesia 25 years ago. And so here he's kind of watching what's going on. These are probably residents who are going through some training. And there's a pre-scripted scenario, what monsters will you run into and what will happen. So they'll be controlling the patient, kind of changing their life vital signs and kind of directing. Sometimes the voice of God will say certain things like, they'll ask like, oh, is this going in a certain way? And then if the simulator doesn't support that, the voice of God will say, yes, you feel something that is lumpy or something. So it provides for human-computer interaction researchers this great opportunity to not only observe in situations where you don't have to deal with HIPAA concerns with privacy, and also you can kind of intervene. So in HEI, you talk about Wizard of Oz, where someone can kind of control behind the scenes, and he provides a really great opportunity for kind of amazing Wizard of Oz scenarios. So Jesse and I spent a year and a half kind of observing lots of these different anesthesia courses. So we watched dozens of doctors kind of go through many of these scenarios, watching from safely behind the one-way mirror. So for example, we watched the same patient die in the same way half a dozen times from the same